At Kalinga, Ashoka did not discover defeat. He discovered what victory had done to him. At Pataliputra, power was not an idea. It was a gate opening, grain weighed under guard, a messenger carrying the king's command beyond his sight. Roads, garrisons, and stone pillars made that command part of daily life. But after Kalinga, the stone does not let conquest stand alone. In the 13th rock edict, the slain, the deported, and the grieving are not hidden beneath glory. They are made part of the record. Here, the first fracture is not a lost province, but a pause beside the seal that sent orders into the empire. The question is why a man strong enough to conquer. Kalinga chose to leave his remorse in stone.
The remorse Ashoka left behind was not a private confession. It was an official voice, cut into rock, meant to be heard across a living empire. To understand why that mattered, we have to begin before Ashoka, before Kalinga, and before the pillars. We begin with rivers. The Ganges, plain offered water, crops, movement, and dense settlement. Along its routes, grain could be collected, officials could travel, and armies could be fed. Power gathered where harvest, road and river could be made to serve a court. That court stood at Pataliputra, near the meeting of the Ganges and the sun. Much of the city was timber, earth, water, and labor. Greek accounts, preserving reports associated with Megasthenes, described a vast capital with wooden defenses, many gates, and hundreds of towers. The numbers belong to a fragile textual trail, but the impression is clear enough. Pataliputra was placed where orders could move. Later excavations around ancient Patna, including traces of wooden palisading, keep that timber city in view without proving every reported detail. The capital was a working seat of power, tied to river traffic, guarded approaches, official compounds, and the storage of grain. Its strength came from position as much as splendor. Magadha had already shown the force of that geography. Older kingdoms in the north had fought for the same fields, crossings, and revenues. By the 4th century before the Common Era, the eastern Gangetic world was producing states large enough to absorb neighbors. The Mauryas inherited this political climate. They gave it a wider reach and a sharper administrative edge. Chandragupta Maurya rose in the unsettled years after Alexander's armies had entered the northwest and then withdrawn. The old order had been disturbed. Chandragupta took Magadha, displaced the Nanda dynasty, and pushed Mauryan power across northern India. On the western edge, he entered conflict with Seleucus I, heir to part of Alexander's eastern world. A treaty followed, shifting territory and opening diplomatic contact. From that beginning came a state of unusual scale. Chandragupta's successors ruled from Bengal towards the northwest. Bindusara, Ashoka's father, is traditionally associated with maintaining and perhaps extending Mauryan authority beyond the northern heartland. The evidence for the exact southern reach before Ashoka is uneven, so the map should be imagined with care. Some regions were closely held. Others were drawn into influence through routes, officials, and negotiated power. A Mauryan road was a political object. Along it moved soldiers, couriers, merchants, monks, tax demands and rumors. At ferries and crossings, the state met the traveler. In market towns, weights and measures brought royal authority into ordinary exchange. In fields, family labor entered a wider system of storage and revenue. The empire lived through these repeated contacts. The court at Pataliputra required officials who could turn distance into obedience. Later political writing, especially the Arthashastra tradition, preserves an image of disciplined and often severe government. Scholars debate how directly that text reflects Mauryan practice. It should not be treated as a simple manual from Ashoka's office. Still, it belongs to a world where kingship was imagined through taxation, treasuries, forts, punishment, and practical rule. Ashoka inherited this machinery. He was the third Mauryan emperor, usually placed in the middle decades of the 3rd century before the Common Era. Buddhist traditions later filled his early life with stories of cruelty, conversion, and miracle. The inscriptions are quieter and harder. They show a king who knew command, and who later chose to explain command in moral language. Before Kalinga, Ashoka had little reason to appear unusual among conquerors. He ruled a state formed by expansion. The army had elephants, infantry, cavalry, and chariots, with an administrative structure behind them. The frontier was a zone of allegiance, pressure, and opportunity. Independent regions beside imperial territory could appear as unfinished business. Kalinga lay on the eastern coast, centered around much of modern Odisha, with wider historical associations beyond it. It looked inland towards river valleys and outward towards the sea. To a Mauryan court, Kalinga may have appeared as a strategically important gap along the eastern seaboard. Its conquest would have mattered to imperial power, even if Ashoka's exact motive cannot be recovered. The campaign came after Ashoka had secured the throne. The field decisions, negotiations, and local voices are lost. What survives is the inscriptional aftermath. In the 13th major rock edict, the royal voice says that Kalinga was conquered 8 years after Ashoka's consecration. Then the record gives numbers for those killed, deported, and lost in the suffering that followed. Those figures belong to a royal inscription, not a neutral report from the field. They may carry rhetorical force as well as memory. Yet their presence is extraordinary. Ancient rulers often counted tribute, captured territory, and defeated enemies as marks of success. Ashoka counted the human cost and allowed that count to change the meaning of victory. The edict names more than soldiers. It speaks of Brahmins, Shramanas, householders, relatives, friends, servants, and dependents. The pain of conquest is described as spreading through families and communities. The king who ordered the war made its consequences part of the public record. We cannot stand inside Ashoka's mind. We can hear the official self-image he chose to carve. That distinction matters. The story is often told as a sudden inner collapse after battle. The surviving evidence is more disciplined than that. It shows a ruler presenting his transformation through inscriptions, policy, and public ethics. His remorse may have been deeply felt. It was also deliberately communicated. After Kalinga, moral unease became part of royal government. The word he used was Dhamma. It came from the same root as Dharma, but Ashoka's use cannot be reduced to a single English term. It could mean moral order, right conduct, piety, self-control, welfare, and respect. It was shaped by Buddhism, and Ashoka clearly supported the Buddhist community. Yet his Dhamma was broader than a demand for all subjects to become Buddhist. That breadth mattered in a diverse empire. Farmers, merchants, monks, Brahmins, Ajivikas, Householders. Forest communities and frontier groups lived under Mauryan authority. They did not share one sacred language or one ritual life. A king who ruled across those differences needed a public ethic that could travel. Dhamma gave Ashoka a vocabulary of restraint, duty, and social order. Major Rock Edict 12 gives one of the clearest views of that policy. Ashoka urges restraint in praising one's own sect and criticizing another. He asks for honor to be given across religious communities, because the growth of one tradition need not depend on insulting the rest. Modern liberalism would be the wrong comparison. This was an ancient imperial answer to the problem of governing difference. The answer was carved, carried, and heard. Many people in the empire would not have read the inscriptions directly. Officials, monks, scribes, and local notables acted as mediators. In a market, near a road, beside a sacred place, a royal message could be spoken aloud. The stone held the words. Human voices made them travel. Ashoka's inscriptions appeared in many landscapes. Some were cut into rock faces. Others were placed on polished sandstone pillars. At Dhauli and Jaugada, in the conquered Kalinga region, separate edicts address officers at Tosali and Samapa. Their tone is revealing. The king speaks of his wish that all people should gain welfare and happiness, then turns that wish into instruction. Here, moral language touches administration directly. It reaches beyond a sermon about kindness. It becomes a command to officials who could imprison, release, delay, intimidate, or protect. In these edicts, Ashoka recognizes that suffering can be caused by harshness, jealousy, impatience, idleness, and slackness. The words are plain because the problem is practical. A royal order might arrive at Tosali as a sealed message, then become a meeting, a reprimand, or a change in procedure. A prisoner might hear that a case had been reviewed. A Rajuka in a rural district might be reminded to judge without rashness. A village might learn that the king expected restraint from his agents. Ethics had entered the paperwork of rule. In Major Rock Edict 5, Ashoka says he appointed Dhamma Mahamatas, senior officers concerned with Dhamma, after 13 years of consecration. Their duties included attention to different groups and religious communities. The office itself is striking. A moral program had become an administrative category. Compassion was given personnel, reports, and responsibility. Other officials appear more briefly in the inscriptions, but the point is not the title list. It is the reach of the idea. A message about restraint passed into rural judgment, prison procedure, road inspection, and provincial reporting. The king's language had to survive the hands of men who could be impatient, ambitious, or careless. Ashoka seems to have understood that danger. Then comes the contradiction that gives the policy its tension. In the same imperial voice that praises restraint, Ashoka warns forest peoples that the king still has power. He expresses regret over violence, but he also tells unconquered communities to behave in a way that avoids punishment. Compassion and coercion stand close together. The language changed. The authority remained. That warning prevents the reign from becoming a fable. Ashoka's Dhamma moved through the state's roads, officers, and punishments. An edict could urge patience, and the same system could enforce obedience. A polished pillar might speak of welfare while soldiers guarded the frontier road nearby. The moral turn was real, but it traveled in imperial clothes. Dhamma also entered the landscape through welfare measures. The edicts speak of medical provision for people and animals, of useful herbs, wells, and trees along routes. These claims should be read as royal ideals as well as practical orders. Still, they offer a different set of images. A traveller resting in shade, a water point beside a road, an official checking conditions after a command has been read aloud. The pillars gave that ambition form. They were quarried, shaped, polished, transported and raised with extraordinary skill. A shaft of sandstone could stand above a settlement or sacred site, carrying the royal voice into open air. The Sarnath lion capital, carved in polished sandstone, later became one of the most recognizable objects from ancient India. In Ashoka's time, such work announced both devotion and command. The polished surface mattered. Mauryan craftsmanship could make stone catch light with a finish that still startles the eye. For a passerby, the pillar was height, sheen, text, and authority. It joined a local road to a distant court. Unlike timber, it was meant to survive beyond the hand that ordered it. Ashoka's reach extended into a wider world. In the northwest, at Kandahar, his message entered a landscape shaped by earlier Persian rule and Greek settlement after Alexander. Inscriptions there used Greek and Aramaic. The choice of language shows a court speaking to more than one cultural audience. Mauryan power had to communicate across political memory as well as geography. The Kandahar evidence also reminds us that Ashoka's empire faced outward. His edicts mention Hellenistic rulers beyond the frontier, including Antiochus and other Western kings. We should not imagine these references as proof of transformation in distant courts. They reveal Ashoka's claim to a moral geography larger than his territory. He wanted Dhamma to travel where armies no longer would. This is one of the most unusual claims of his reign. After Kalinga, Ashoka speaks of conquest by Dhamma. The phrase carries the old energy of victory, but redirects it towards persuasion, welfare, and moral conduct. The imperial instinct had not disappeared. It had been given a new grammar. Buddhism gained greatly from this redirection. Ashoka's own inscriptions show reverence for the Buddha, visits to sacred sites, and concern for the Sangha. Later, Buddhist chronicles enlarged that record into a more sacred biography, with grand accounts of stupas and missionary activity. The distinction matters. The inscriptions prove patronage and moral policy. Later memory made Ashoka into a model Buddhist king. The two images should be held apart, but not separated completely. The Ashoka of Buddhist tradition shaped how later communities remembered the spread of the faith. The Ashoka of the edicts shows a ruler working through administration, instruction, and public ethics. One belongs to religious memory. The other belongs to stone. Together, they explain why his presence became so durable. Everyday life under his rule carried these tensions. A merchant on a road might value security and resent tolls. A farmer might depend on stable authority, then struggle under a revenue demand. A monk might welcome patronage, while a Brahmin heard royal language urging mutual respect. A soldier might serve an emperor who now praised restraint more than conquest. The Mauryan state had to hold these worlds together. Pataliputra was the center, but provincial and regional points mattered greatly. Tosali and Samapa are directly addressed in the Kalinga edicts. Suvarnagiri appears in southern administrative context. Taxila and Ujjain are remembered in later traditions and broader accounts as important centers of Mauryan power. The evidence differs, so the map must remain cautious. Through such places moved orders, metals, animals, grain, cloth, timber, tribute, and people seeking favor or justice. Through them also moved discontent, Taxila, remembered in tradition as a place of unrest, suggests the difficulty of governing distant regions. Every imperial center had its own officials and local relationships. Distance gave provincial power its own gravity. Ashoka's reign appears stable when seen through the grandeur of the inscriptions. Yet the scale of the empire made stability hard to renew. A strong emperor could keep the system aligned. After him, the same offices, provinces and commanders could begin to answer to nearer interests. An empire of roads can move orders quickly. It can also carry news of weakness. The first cracks were structural as much as moral. Kalinga exposed the cost of conquest, but it did not create the empire's fragility. Mauryan unity depended on revenue, succession, provincial loyalty, military organization, and the prestige of the center. Ashoka's Dhamma gave that unity a moral language. It could not guarantee that every successor would command the same obedience. Traditionally, Ashoka's death is placed in 232 before the Common Era, though ancient chronologies vary. After him, the line of succession becomes uncertain. Later traditions name sons and grandsons, but the political sequence is difficult to reconstruct. Some historians have suggested division within the empire. Epigraphic evidence indicates that Dasharatha ruled in Magadha, but the wider imperial picture becomes less clear. The evidence does not let us watch the breakdown closely. It lets us see likely pressures and later results. The decline began with a thinning of command. A province answered slowly, then selectively. A governor learned to act without waiting for Pataliputra. Revenue once sent to the capital could remain closer to local power. Merchants still moved, but through a world of more authorities. These are pressures historians infer from later patterns, not events preserved in a continuous record. The Northwest faced changing powers beyond the Hindu Kush, including Hellenistic and later Greco-Bactrian forces. In the south and east, regions drawn into Mauryan influence could move back towards local dynastic futures. Kalinga itself would not remain permanently absorbed in the old imperial form. The treasury and army must also be considered with caution. A state of Mauryan scale required steady revenue, paid personnel, animals, roads, and supplies. If provinces delivered less reliably, the center's authority suffered. If commanders gained too much independent force, the army became a political danger. Large empires often fail in the gap between issuing orders and enforcing them. Ashoka's Dhamma may have offered a moral identity, but succession needed more than ideals. Distant elites had to remain loyal after the fear of the center weakened. Frontiers had to be defended at a cost the court could bear. The more the empire depended on central discipline, the more vulnerable it became when that discipline loosened. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, Mauryan authority had contracted sharply. What had once reached across much of the subcontinent became a reduced power centered on older heartlands. The imperial tone may have survived in ceremony, but the reach behind it shortened. Roads still existed. Pillars still stood. Officials still worked. The command from Pataliputra no longer carried the same weight. A contraction like this changes daily life before it changes monuments. A local ruler stops sending full tribute. A commander negotiates for himself. A court seal means less at a frontier post. The trader adapts. The village negotiates. The monk travels under new patrons. The empire does not vanish from every road at once. It becomes local, patchy, and easier to challenge. The last act came with Brihadratha, remembered as the final Mauryan ruler. around the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. He was killed by his commander-in-chief, Pushyamitra, who founded the Shunga dynasty. Later accounts place the killing during a military review. The scene's details are not fully recoverable. The political meaning is plain enough. The army's highest officer removed the king. That ending tells us something stark about the Mauryan state. The dynasty that built one of the ancient world's great imperial machines ended with power passing through the military elite. The center did not fade only into memory and ruins. It was replaced. A commander stepped through the weakened frame of monarchy and made a new order from what remained. After that, the subcontinent did not fall silent. Regional kingdoms developed. Trade continued. Religious communities adapted. The world after the Mauryas was not empty. It was plurality returning after imperial concentration. In some places, that meant revived local authority. In others, it meant new dynastic competition. The map became less unified, but still alive. Pataliputra endured, though the Mauryan city of timber could not survive intact. Wood decayed, rivers shifted, later building covered earlier traces. Archaeology gives fragments where the ancient capital once managed a continent of orders. A post hole, a palisade line, a polished stone piece, a name in a text. These are quieter remains than a standing palace, but they ask for careful attention. The pillars survived differently. Some broke. Some were moved. Some lost their capitals. Others remained as vertical witnesses in landscapes that changed around them. Their inscriptions help modern scholars recover Ashoka as a historical ruler, rather than only a figure in Buddhist memory. When Brahmi script was deciphered in the 19th century, the royal voice became legible again. That rediscovery changed Ashoka's afterlife. The emperor who had faded from some strands of memory returned through stone. His reign and policy could be set beside archaeology, texts, and regional history. The result was not a perfect biography. It was something more valuable. A ruler whose public language could still be examined in his own words. The Sarnath lion capital gave his legacy a modern form. 4 lions faced outward from a polished stone drum once set above a pillar at a site sacred to Buddhism. In modern India, that ancient capital became the basis of the state emblem. The wheel associated with Ashokan symbolism appears at the center of the national flag. These later uses show how surviving forms can be made to speak again. Yet the deepest survival is still the 13th rock edict. Its force lies in the discomfort it preserves. Ashoka did not present Kalinga as simple glory. He placed conquest under moral pressure. He allowed the suffering of households, religious communities, and deported people to disturb the royal record. For a ruler to admit harm is rare. For that admission to shape policy is rarer. Near a weathered rock face, the letters still hold their lines. The surface is no longer fresh from the chisel. Rain, heat, and centuries have done their quiet work. A passerby sees stone before meaning. Then the words begin to return. Conquest, grief, restraint, duty. The emperor is gone, but the record still refuses to let victory stand alone. At Sarnath, the lions are no longer high above a Mauryan road. They are museum stone now, separated from the full height that once carried them. Their polish remains, but the world that made them has vanished. The court, the quarry teams, the officers, the road dust, the royal command leaving Pataliputra. What is a victory worth when the ruler who wins it cannot bear the record of its cost? On the road from Kalinga to Pataliputra, the empire reached its most unsettling moment. It had forced submission, widened the frontier, and made the imperial map appear more complete. Then its ruler ordered stone to remember the people left behind by success. The timber gates are gone. The couriers are gone. The officers and soldiers have become names, offices, and traces in the ground. But the edicts remain on rock and pillar, carrying the old question through damaged surfaces. Ashoka won Kalinga. Then he made victory answer for itself.